Coming up, a musket ball through and through, Lafayette, the hero, pretty girls. Welcome to Living Lafayette, Lafayette Alliance in LaGrange, Georgia. I'm Richard. This is the story about how Lafayette became a hero. It was on Thursday, September the 11th, 1777, at the Battle of Brandywine, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Brandywine had more men in play than any other battle in the American Revolutionary War, 30,000. It was a marathon. It lasted longer than any battle, except the Battle of Monmouth 1 year later in 1778, 11 hours. General William Howe thought if he could capture Philadelphia, the capital of the 13 colonies, where the Second Continental Congress was meeting, if he could capture Philadelphia, it would be near over, the end of the American Revolution. So, General Howe loaded 260 ships, some 17,000 to 18,000 men in New York City, loaded them on those ships and sailed past Sandy Hook on July 23rd, 1777, down the East Coast, took a hairpin turn into Chesapeake Bay, and then parked at the peak of the bay and disembarked at Head of Elk, Maryland, on August 25th, 1777. He unloaded 17,000 to 18,000 men and then marched toward Brandywine Creek and Chad's Ford, which was some 26 miles southwest of Philadelphia. On September the 11th, he was at Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, which is now, incidentally, the mushroom capital of the world. He split his forces that day. One, the smaller contingent, about 7,000, 8,000 men, would head up the Great Road toward Brandywine Creek and Chad's Ford. This would be under the command of General Wilhelm Kniphausen. Kniphausen was 61 years old. He was from Hesse Castle. He was one of those 12,000 Hessians that Great Britain had employed to fight in America. He had fought under Frederick the Great. He was respected. They started their march at 5:30 that morning. A second contingent, the larger of the two, some 10,000 men, headed north. They were under the command of Lord Cornwallis, and General William Howe went with them. They headed north. Brandywine Creek splits into a west branch and an east branch. Cornwallis led his men across the ford up the west branch, Trimble's Ford, and then the ford across the east branch, Jeffrey's Ford, and then south to flank Washington. General Howe had been at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British did what they always do. They lined up, and it was a direct frontal assault. Well, they won, but it was a dear-bought victory. It was expensive. They lost a lot of men. It was Pyrrhic. Howe was also at the Battle of Long Island a year later in 1776. And they did a flanking maneuver this time. They surprised Washington. Howe was now taking that play out of the playbook. He would flank Washington. Washington, for his part, lined his men up along Brandywine Creek. 6 miles south of Chad's Ford, there was General John Armstrong. He had 1,000 Pennsylvania militia, and he was guarding Pyle's Ford. At Chad's Ford, there were two major generals there. So Major General Nathaniel Greene and Mad Anthony Wayne. Then 3 divisions above that, Major General John Sullivan and William Alexander Lord Stirling. William Alexander had this Scottish pedigree, and he maintained that Lord Stirling title. There was some question about its authenticity, but it was American, nobody cared. And then Adam Stephen. Not a month later, at the Battle of Germantown, Adam Stephen was accused of being inebriated. He was cashiered out of the army. And then just north of that was Colonel Mose Hayden. Colonel Hayden was covering Wistar's Ford and Buffington's Ford. Washington thought he had it all covered. He was unaware of those 2 fords up across the branches west and east of Brandywine Creek. Washington also had an advance guard there in front of Chadds Ford. It was about 4 miles west of Chadds Ford, and that's where the skirmishes began, at Welsh's Tavern. The British forced the Continentals back, it was about 9 a.m., to the old Kennett Meeting House. And in fact, the Quakers were having a meeting at the time. The Continentals hid behind that stone structure, and the British attacked and drove them back to Chadds Ford. And then they settled into slapping at one another. So there were skirmishes, they were cannonading. Washington rode up and down the line, building morale, spirits were good. Lafayette was there. Lafayette spent the night at the Benjamin Ring House, which was Washington's headquarters. And now he was with Washington, as Washington rode up and down the line. The Continentals felt good about things. Meanwhile, Lord Cornwallis, doing his flanking maneuver, took time out at Osborne's Hill at 2 p.m. Washington had gotten intelligence that there was this flanking maneuver earlier, but it was discredited. It was thought to be faulty information. But now, with 10,000 troops settled out at Osborne's Hill, Washington knew this was for real. He took those 3 divisions north of Chadds Ford, John Sullivan, William Alexander Lord Stirling, and Adam Stephen, and wheeled them around to face the oncoming flanking maneuver from Lord Cornwallis. Major General John Sullivan would be in overall command. Cornwallis launched his attack at 4 p.m. Lafayette could see that things were shaping up over on that right side. That was going to be the main frontal assault on that right flank. He did not want to be a spectator. He did not want to be left out. He asked Washington if he could join Sullivan's division. Think about it just a minute. Washington had gotten a letter from Benjamin Franklin telling Washington not to hazard this young aristocrat, that he was well thought of back in the fleet. And the Continental Congress, they had commissioned Lafayette, but it was an honorary commission. If anything catastrophic happened to Lafayette, it would fall on Washington. And yet at the same time, Washington had come to know Lafayette. Lafayette was enthusiastic, he was genuine, he believed in the cause. Washington nodded consent. He permitted Lafayette to join that right flank. It's interesting to speculate what would have happened had Washington declined permission. My suspicion is Lafayette would have found some other opportunity to get in the battle. So Lafayette and his aide, Jumont, they galloped off to join that middle division, William Alexander Lord Stirling, and in fact, not just the middle division, but the middle brigade, 800 men under Brigadier General Thomas Conway. Lord Cornwallis attacked with a vengeance at 4:30. One would think that Lafayette, he just celebrated his 20th birthday, September the 6th. One would think that he might, and this was the first time he had really seen real bullets coming toward him, one would think that he might be somewhat reserved, that he might want to get a pulse of things, to see how things were going. Or impressions were important, that Lafayette wouldn't want to overstep his bounds, or maybe be a little hanging back just a bit. Not so. Lafayette did not stutter. He didn't miss a beat. Lafayette, I think, on this field was a chess master. He was Magnus Carlsen without the Norwegian accent. It was here at this moment where Vercingetorix, Plutarch, Cicero, they all came together. Lafayette could see what was transpiring. Lafayette galloped into the center of things. Some of the Continentals were on their heels. They were backing up. Lafayette jumped off his horse. He grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him forward. Well, this was novel experience. They were now attacking an enemy that was attacking them. Many of the Continentals, they wouldn't go forward, but at least they didn't go backward. They held their ground. There were several Frenchmen, many Frenchmen, who were in Thomas Conway's brigade, and they were pleased to see Lafayette. They fixed bayonets. They were ready for hand-to-hand combat. At one point, the Continentals and the English, they were within 60 feet of one another. Lafayette took a musket ball to his left leg below the calf. It didn't hurt at first. It was through and through. But he looked down to see his boot full of blood. Well, that was a new experience for him. He kept on doing what he was doing, trying to direct things, but then he felt drained. And then he went down. He didn't pass out, but he went down. Now, we can assume normal blood pressure is 120/80. We can assume that Lafayette's systolic blood pressure was less than 90. The reason is that typically if you're in the upright position and your blood pressure drops to less than 90, it's hard for the heart to perfuse the brain to keep you upright because gravity is pulling that blood pressure down towards your feet. It's whenever you get that feeling, sometimes you stand up too fast and you feel that curtain coming down. Well, that's where your blood pressure is dropping. Well, Lafayette was down. Well, when he was down, gravity no longer holds sway and reflexes could rally. So this is where the arteries now tighten up and they can generate that perfusion pressure, and because they constrict, it also stems that blood loss down in his calf. We can also assume that even though he got shot in the left leg below the calf, it didn't transect the Achilles tendon. The reason we know that is because when he got shot, he kept doing what he was doing. Well, if you rupture that Achilles tendon, you cannot pivot. You can't move, and you get pain in the heel that will stop you in your tracks. Gimont saw this. His aide rushed over and helped to hoist Lafayette back on his horse. Lafayette wouldn't have been able to do that had his reflexes not rallied. And then they galloped off to sanctuary over in nearby woods. Dr. John Cochrane, who was Washington's personal physician, came over and hastily bandaged Lafayette's leg. And then they joined the stream of Continentals going back to Chester, some 12 miles away. Knyphausen punched through Chad's Ford. Lord Cornwallis attacking that right flank just caved. Now there was a whole stream of Continentals going back the road toward Chester, some 12 miles away. And Lafayette saw how chaotic the retreat was, how efficient it was. So even wounded, there was a stone bridge across Chester Creek. Lafayette stopped at that stone bridge and organized the retreat. Then they carried Lafayette to a nearby house and they filleted him out on the breakfast table right there. Not long after, Dr. John Cochrane came to better attend the wounds. General Washington came, General Nathaniel Greene, their entourage. The story goes that Lafayette looked up and saw how hungry these men were, not having eaten for a while, and implored them not to assume that he was the main item on the menu. Washington told Cochrane to take care of Lafayette as though he were my own son. They found a boat that was going up the Delaware to Philadelphia. They loaded Lafayette on it, and he stayed at the Indian Queen Hotel there in Philadelphia. Midnight that night, Washington wrote his report to Congress, knowing that the world at some time would read it. Here's what he said. Notwithstanding the misfortune of the day, I'm happy to find the troops in good spirits, and I hope another time we shall compensate for the losses now sustained. The Marquis de Lafayette was wounded in the leg, and General Woodford's in the hand. Horace Walpole read that report back in London sometime later. Walpole couldn't believe that a commander-in-chief at midnight, after a trying day, would take time to mention a lowly marquis. Lafayette stayed in Philadelphia for 4 days, September the 12th through September the 16th. 3 things happened when he was in Philadelphia. First, his French friends came to congratulate him on his wound. He was a hero now. One of those friends was Lieutenant Dubois-Martin. Dubois-Martin, you remember, was recruited by Silas Deane and made a major. He was going to be aide-de-camp to Baron de Kalb. But Congress didn't authenticate the commission. So Dubois-Martin came by to visit and to congratulate Lafayette. You remember Dubois-Martin? He was the one back in Paris at the Hotel d'Ingram, was the first to suggest to Lafayette that he buy his own boat. Dubois-Martin was the one who went to Bordeaux and found La Victoire. That Dubois-Martin. Other French officers came to visit Lafayette, and they all tried to persuade him to come back to France with them. But Lafayette was in his element. I mean, he was a hero now. He had a reputation. He liked where he was. And he had gotten to know Washington, and he admired Washington more and more. He would not return to France. He would stay. But he would lobby Congress to try to get his friends and their commissions authenticated. Second, Baron de Kalb was negotiating with Congress to get his commission authenticated. Congress had to overcome their reluctance, you remember, because they knew Baron de Kalb and Vicomte de Moray, that they were the standard bearers for the de Broglie intrigue. Comte de Broglie saw himself as replacing George Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. De Kalb had come to know Washington and to know the Continental Congress. De Kalb wrote de Broglie to say that to try to replace Washington would be an injustice to Washington, and it would undermine the integrity of the Continental Congress. The de Broglie intrigue was done. It was over. The Continental Congress was impressed with de Kalb, not only his experience, but he was quite civil in his negotiations with them over this commission. They agreed to authenticate his commission as a major general. And in fact, they would predate it before Lafayette's. Lafayette's was July 31st, 1777. Congress said, we'll predate it before that. Baron de Kalb would have none of that. And in fact, here's what he said about Lafayette. So this is a Teutonic, German-born. Here's what he said about Lafayette. No one, said de Kalb, deserves more than he the esteem which he enjoys here. He is a prodigy for his age, full of courage, spirit, judgment, good manners, feelings of generosity, and of zeal for the cause of liberty. That's a mighty high compliment. And Chevalier Dubuisson would be his aide-de-camp, lieutenant colonel. Continental Congress was on board. They were commissioned. The third thing that happened in Philadelphia, the British were coming. They were going to take Philadelphia So the Continental Congress decamped. They would head north. They'd go through Bristol and then through Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then on to Lancaster, where they would meet for a day, and then on to York, Pennsylvania, which is where they would hold their meetings thereafter. Lafayette stayed in Philadelphia 4 days, and then they found a boat and ferried him up 20 miles to Bristol, up the Delaware River to Bristol. There he stayed at the home of Simon Betts. Simon's niece took care of Lafayette, and she developed some notoriety as a consequence of that. From Bristol, Lafayette went to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Bethlehem was a Moravian community, and they were pacifists. They didn't fight in the war, but they did take care of the wounded. Henry Lawrence was traveling by coach through Bristol. He picked Lafayette up and gave him a ride to Bethlehem. Lawrence was a South Carolina plantation owner. He was wealthy. He was a member of the Continental Congress, would become president of the Continental Congress on November the 1st. He would replace John Hancock. Lawrence's son, John Lawrence, would become one of Lafayette's best friends. John Lawrence was an adamant abolitionist. He tried to persuade his father to free the slaves on their plantation in South Carolina. Henry Lawrence also was a partner in the slave trading firm of Austin and Lawrence, the largest in North America. Henry Lawrence was very wealthy. So his son John tried to persuade him to release his slaves. John also tried to persuade the Continental Congress to recruit African Americans into the Continental Army. It's interesting that Lawrence, subsequently in 1780, was ambassador to the Netherlands. He was captured by the British at sea, and he was held in the Tower of London, the only American ever to be imprisoned in the Tower of London. And, spoiler alert, he came back home in a prisoner exchange on December 31st, 1781. The prisoner for which he was exchanged was Lord Cornwallis. Oh, one other piece of notoriety for Henry Lawrence. The story goes that he was the first European to be voluntarily cremated in the Americas. He was so feared being buried alive. So Henry Lawrence and Lafayette, riding by coach, went from Bristol, the 80 miles, to Bethlehem. They got to know one another. They liked each other. They were good friends. Lafayette was working the room. And it's not that it was intended. It's just that Lafayette was friendly. He made friends easily. So he was making contacts. In Bethlehem, he stayed at the Sun Inn. The Sun Inn was built by Moravians for non-Moravians who had business there in Bethlehem. The Sun Inn today is a tavern, a restaurant, and a museum. And then shortly thereafter, he went to stay at the home of Moravian leader George Frederick Beckel. Beckel had a daughter, Lisa, very attractive. She's the one who took care of Lafayette. This was rehab, 18th century style. Lafayette had time on his hands, so he worked on his English. He studied French philosophy, Abbé Raynal. He learned about the Moravians. He admired them. They held community in property. They held property in community, and they were comfortable with that. They were very devout and pious. They were sincere in their religion. They were pacifists, and they were not above trying to persuade Lafayette to that mindset. They liked Lafayette. He was a listener, and he was empathetic. And Lafayette wrote a lot of letters, which got him into yet another intrigue, the Conway Cabal. This is Living Lafayette, to discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.